Oh, what an exciting world. Satellites, waveguides, lasers, magnetic bubbles, fiber optics, picture phones someday, maybe even in color.
Hello and welcome to Part 2 of Advanced HTML. The reason we have forms in the first place is to collect information from our users. There is all sorts of information that we may want. Maybe we're taking a poll. Maybe we're Google and we need a way to have people search for information on the web. Maybe we're a business and someone ordered something. So of course, we need to get their address and billing information. And unless you called on the phone or ordered by mail, who does that anymore? You need a form. Pretty much any form you encounter on the web will do one or all of these things. Enter text, whether it is a single line of text input, a password input, a text input of multiple lines. Give you choices, whether it is through a set of radio buttons, a set of checkboxes, a drop-down box with a single selection or multiple selections. Upload a file, and submit this whole collection of text and choices and files and such. All of these bits of information that make up a form are called form controls. Let's have a quick look at how forms work. What happens when you click that glorious submit button at the bottom? Well, each of the form controls will have a name and value associated with it. We'll get into the names of form controls later on, but the text we enter and the choices we make are all values. These values usually get sent to the server, which processes this information with some programming language like PHP or C or Java. The server may also store this information in a database. After that, the server will create a new page to send back to the browser based on the information that was provided. This new page is often something like, "Thank you for your order," or "Please enter the missing required information." Basic structure of forms. Let's make a form. The first thing we start with is the form tag. The form tag contains all the form controls. But before we get into any of the form controls, the next thing we need for our form is to add the action attribute. The value we use for the action attribute is the URL for the page on the server that will receive the information in the form when it gets submitted. Most of the time, it is some PHP page. But since that is mostly out of the scope of this class, we will set up our form so that instead, the form information will get emailed back to ourselves. So in this case, we will substitute mail to instead of HTTP. The next thing we need, before we get into any form controls, is the method attribute. There are two ways for forms to send information, and this gets called in the method attribute. The first way is get. You see get in action when you do a Google search. The search terms you use get appended to the end of the URL specified in the action attribute. The get method is ideal for short forms, like a Google search box, or when you're retrieving data from a web server. When you're adding information to or deleting from a database, instead of the get method, we use the post method. This is better for forms that upload a file, or have a lot of information, or contain sensitive data like passwords. One last thing before we get into form controls, our old friend ID. Using an ID will help distinguish the form from other elements on the page. This is especially helpful down the line when you use JavaScript or other scripts. The JavaScript will need an ID to latch onto so it can do cool interactive things with the form. Even if we don't get too deep into JavaScript this semester, it's a good idea for us to use IDs in our forms anyway. Form controls. Form controls are also referred to as input types. You may see either term used out in the world, so let's look at the form controls for text. The input element is used to create different form controls based on the type attribute we use in combination with it. For example, input type text creates a single line of text. We talked before about how forms send a name and a value to a server. The next thing we put in our code is the name of the form control. So now our code looks like this. Notice that there is no closing tag, just a slash and right arrow bracket. Now then, it is a good idea to specify a maximum character length here, so we can add a max length attribute and a number like so, and we're done. So that was a single line text input. Password inputs are mostly the same, except instead of type text, we use type password, so it looked like this. Important note: although passwords are hidden on the screen, they're not automatically encrypted or sent securely to the server. For this reason, you shouldn't use type password for credit card numbers. To really get secure, you would need to set up secure sockets layer on the server. This is also beyond the scope of the course, but you can read more about it on MDN. For multiple lines of text, called a text area, it gets its own tag, the text area tag. Unlike input, text area needs a closing tag. So here's an example of the text area in action. Any text that appears between the tags also appears in the browser, so that text will also get submitted to the server, unless your user deletes it first. There is also JavaScript that will delete it for you when a user clicks in the text area. So those were the text form controls. Next, let's look at how to make choices. Radio buttons. Radio buttons allow users to pick just one of a number of options. We see these all the time as circles. Just like with text controls, the code is written in with the input tag and a name. Radio buttons use type radio, like so. We also need to specify a value of the radio button. This represents the choice the user made. Make sure you use a different value for each one, otherwise the server won't know the difference. For all the radio button choices, make sure to keep the name the same. We can also set a default choice from the page first loads using the checked attribute. Only one radio button in any group should use this attribute. One last thing about radio buttons. Once a radio button has been selected, it cannot be deselected. The user can only select a different option. So, if you would like to give your users the ability to deselect an option, you would use instead the checkbox input type. Checkboxes allow the user to select and deselect one or more options in answer to a question. These are written exactly the same way as radio buttons, except with a type checkbox. Remember how we said that the name for all radio button choices should be the same? For all checkboxes in a group, the name should be the same too. Drop-down list box. We can make choices using a drop-down list, otherwise known as a select box. The select element is used to make this list, and the list consists of option elements, like so. You can see that we use the name attribute and the value attribute just as before. The drop-down list box version of the checked attribute is selected. If we don't use the selected attribute, then the first option in the list will be shown when the page loads. Drop-down list boxes function very similarly to radio buttons in that only one option can be selected. So which one to use? Ask yourself these two questions. Does the user need to see all the options at once? Then radio buttons are probably better. Is it a long list of options? Then a drop-down list would probably work better. Just like radio buttons have a checkbox counterpart, drop-down list boxes have a similar counterpart. This counterpart is the multiple select box, where you can select more than one option at a time from a drop-down list. They are written the same way, but we add the multiple attribute. It is a good idea to tell your users that multiple options are possible, if that's the case. It's also helpful to indicate that on a PC, they should hold down the Control key while selecting multiple options, and on a Mac, they should hold down the Command key. File uploads. To give users the option of uploading a file, we use type file, like so. The last piece of the file upload is a button to actually perform the upload. We can use type submit to make a button, and use value to give the button some text, like so. And this is the same way we make the final overall submit button. For once, the name attribute is not necessary, but it's still good to use. Some browsers have default text that they will put inside the submit button, so it's always good to pick your own value. And finally, there is a way to use an image as a submit button instead. For this, we use the type image, and we add src like we would with any other image, like so. Also notice that we can specify width and height right inside there too.